Okay, welcome everybody. My name is Julio Watto, and this is the speaker series of Science and Society. Science and Society is a journal of Marxist thought that has been published continuously in the English language for over 75 years, longer than that. And we have here several members of the editorial board. David Leibman, the chief editor, is on. And we have today Professor Utsa Patnaik. But before we start, before we introduce her formally, I should thank St. Francis College because they are providing us with a Zoom platform for this event. And again, warn you about the video recording. And with that said, I'm going to pass the microphone to my Science and Society colleague Ying Chen.
Thank you, Julio. My name is Ying Chen, Assistant Professor of Economics at the New School, and currently serve as member of the Science and Society editorial board. So I'm delighted to have the honor to introduce Professor Utsa Patnaik today, whose works have made a profound impact on my own dissertation many years ago and my approach to studying political economy ever since. So Professor Utsa Patnaik is a worldwide esteemed Marxist economist and Professor Emeritus at Center for Economic Studies and Planning at the Jawaharlal Nehru University in India. She has written extensively on the agrarian question, as well as theory of capitalism and imperialism in general. Among many of her publications, she co-authored with Professor Patnaik on the book A Theory of Imperialism, as well as a forthcoming book entitled Capital and Imperialism, Theory, History, and the Present, to be published next year. So, is imperialism still a relevant concept for today? I think this is a question of both theoretical and practical significance, and hence is heatedly debated among the leftist scholars and activists. Today, we are all very pleased to have Professor Patnaik here to share her thoughts on this crucial issue. So after Professor's talk, we expect to have 30 to 45 minutes Q&A session, and the entire event is expected to end by 11 a.m. US Eastern Time, which is going to be 8:30 p.m. At Professor's local time. So without further delay, please join me in welcoming Professor Patnaik.
Well, firstly, I would like to thank the editorial board of Science and Society for asking me to give this talk today. Of course, we all grew up from our early student days reading Science and Society, particularly the transition from feudalism to capitalism debate, which became so famous. Now, the title for my talk today is rather ambitious, and obviously, I will only be able to deal with some limited aspects of colonialism and imperialism, history and the present, in the very short time which is available to me. I could go on for 5 or 6 hours on that subject, but obviously I have only about 50 minutes to 1 hour. Let's first get one question out of the way. I find when I read people writing on imperialism, so I find that a number of people who write on imperialism seem to think that it happened. Colonialism happened, imperialism happened, but it is not really intrinsic to capitalism as such. That is the Industrial Revolution in Britain, the diffusion of industrialization to the rest of what became the capitalist world would have taken place anyway. It was helped along a bit, perhaps, but it would have happened in any case. Well, that is a position with which I don't agree, and neither does my spouse. We have been exploring the proposition that the rise of industrial capitalism and its diffusion, its global diffusion later on, would not have been possible at all without colonialism and imperialism. That is, it is an intrinsic part of the working and stability of the capitalist system. And this is a proposition which is not new. My spouse, to whom Ying referred earlier, Prabhat Patnaik, wrote almost 3 decades ago a book called Accumulation and Stability Under Capitalism. Came out from Oxford University Press, I think 1992, in which he explored this proposition of colonialism being an integral part of the rise of capitalist system itself. And he went on to write a book called The Value of Money. And we jointly authored some 4 years ago a theory of imperialism, in which essentially the same idea is being put forward. Now, this idea that colonialism was an integral part of industrial revolution, and without it, the modern capitalist system that we know today would not have arisen at all. Now, this is something I started exploring in the specific case of India. Now, India is, of course, the ideal example because it was ruled for the best part of 2 centuries by the first country which industrialized in Europe, that is Britain. The Chinese case is somewhat different. China, as we know, was characterized by Mao Zedong as a semi-colonial, semi-feudal economy. China is a country which had the incursion of practically every imperialist country, both the old imperialist countries like Britain and France, Netherlands, Belgium, and so on, as well as the new late industrializers like Japan and Tsarist Russia and Germany, all of which carved out concessions. They wanted China's mineral wealth, its resources, and they entered into long-term 99-year agreements. But there was no prolonged period of actual direct political rule, other than, of course, the setting up of the puppet state of Manchukuo by Japan, which I believe lasted from 1931 to 45, which is a rather a short period. But still, Manchukuo needs to be studied. So the country which had the longest period of direct rule, which lost its sovereignty, where the foreign ruler actually acquired the right of collecting taxes, was India under Britain. Now, the specificity of colonial exploitation has not, I think, been fully understood even to this day. And this specificity lay in the fact that the foreigner came to highly productive tropical lands like India, the rest of South Asia, Southeast Asia, China, Africa, Latin America, and so on. Fundamentally not in search of markets to begin with, but in search of resources, resources which it lacked itself. And their problem was that these countries did not wish to trade with them, because as the Chinese Emperor Long Yi famously said in his letter to George III, that China is a country where we have everything we need already. We don't need anything from you. But if you wish to trade, we will allow you to trade. And the same was the case with India. These are highly biodiverse economies before colonization. They met all their internal traditional needs themselves. They did not really need to trade with European countries at all. And that is what lay behind the beginning of the forcible opening up to trade of countries like mine. Now, the point about acquisition of political rights, trade is one thing, but becoming a ruler, that is, turning a country like India into a colony of conquest, essentially lay in the right that the conqueror obtained, the sovereign right of tax collection, which started from 1765 in the case of India with the granting of the Diwani of Bengal to Clive by the declining Mughal Empire in Delhi. And once a trading company got this sovereign right of tax collection, I mean, it had never happened to them before, that they could tax a population of 30 million which was, 4 times the population of Britain at that time, or probably rather more. And they went completely berserk. Between 1765 and 1770, the total revenue collections in Bengal in just these 5 years were raised threefold, using local mercenaries, of course, because the company did not have that many people. And as a result, you had a massive famine by 1770, which is really not talked about at all. The British themselves estimated that 1/3 of the population of Bengal died in that famine. And you might say, why did they not resist? Why did they allow themselves to be taxed so heavily? Their seed corn taken away, their consumption taken away. Well, it was literally a case of a peaceable agricultural community which had been cultivating for decades, centuries, being moderately taxed by the local rulers, suddenly finding a foreigner descending like a wolf on the fold, literally. So the peasants were not armed. And this is what happened. I think it must be the largest famine in history that you have a record of over such a short period of time. Of course, you had a decimation of the Central American population over a much longer period, over a century. But in Bengal, 1/3 of the population disappeared in the course of just 1 year. Now, once the system settled down, the foreigners then set about, because they were traders to begin with, buying their export commodities, the commodities they had traded in and had to pay for in the past, out of the revenues. And it is this system which continued for the best part of 200 years. And this is what led to what the nationalist writers in India called the tribute or the drain of wealth, because this is a very abnormal use of budgetary revenues. No sovereign country in the world has a situation where 1/3 of the net budgetary revenues is being used every single year for purchasing export goods from the peasants. And it is the peasants themselves who have been made to contribute the bulk of the taxation from the budgetary revenues, either in the form of direct tax, that is the land revenue, or indirect taxes through monopoly on salt and so on. So the very people from whom the commodities are being bought for export are the people who are obliged to contribute the taxes out of which the commodities are being bought. Okay, so in analytical terms, these peasants were not being paid for their commodities. They thought they were being paid because they were getting money, but they did not know that the money was coming out of their own taxation that they had paid in. And if their money that is coming to them for their commodities is out of their own taxes, that means they're not being paid. What is simply happening is that portion of their taxes, 1/3 of their taxes, is simply changing its form from cash to goods for export. That is all. It is as though they were being taxed out of those goods. Okay. Now, the first slide before you shows India's merchandise export surplus over a long period, 1833 to 1919. 1833 is when the company's monopoly of trade with India finally ends. 1919 is the end of the First War. And after that, the whole situation becomes very volatile and so on. So I've ended the graph there. You can see that this is an export surplus taking into account the deficit that a colony like India had to incur vis-a-vis the colonizing country Britain, because after the 1840s, factory-made textiles started to be dumped on the Indian market. So India's surplus vis-a-vis Britain itself turned into a deficit. But a surplus vis-a-vis the rest of the world kept going up. So the net surplus, taking India's merchandise surplus, the title to be complete should be with the rest of the world, inclusive of Britain. As you can see, went up steadily. And if you see a blip in the 1860s, suddenly the graph is going up very sharply in the 1860s and then coming down again. That has to do with the Civil War in the United States from 1861 to 66, which, put virtually a halt to cotton exports from the southern states. No, can we stay with this graph for the time being, Julio? Put a halt to the cotton exports from the southern states of the US to India. So Britain turned to India for supplying raw cotton, and there was a huge raw cotton boom. And the export surplus earnings go up. The point is that none of these export surplus earnings, not a single dollar from the US, not a single, the other big trading partner for Indian exports was the European continent, later on also Japan. Not a single penny of sterling that India earned from its rising foreign exchange and gold earnings from its export surplus vis-a-vis the rest of the world came back to the country. And this is something which is not generally realized, that from 1861, there was a great rebellion, as you know, in India between 1857 and 59. The people rose in revolt against British rule. So after this revolt was put down very brutally, the British Crown took over direct governance of India from the East India Company. So after this, the goods no longer went via the East India Company to various parts of the world. They went directly. They didn't go to British ports and then get re-exported. After this point, they went directly to their final destinations, whether it was North America, the European continent, or later on Japan. And of course, China, Indian goods had been going to. Indian opium was forcibly cultivated in order to, that the British could export this opium, force the Chinese to consume opium after opening up their ports, the famous Opium Wars. Of course, the opium trade was illegal, and that is why this degree of force was used, military force and naval force was used to compel the Chinese to consume Indian opium. And the whole objective of that, after 1813, when the company lost its monopoly, was that it was using Indian opium earnings from China to pay for its deficit in its trade with China, because it was running a deficit with China at this time. Its imports of tea and porcelain and silk and so on was far in excess, as you know, of its exports to China. And you have the inception of the famous triangular patterns of trade. This is just the India, China, Britain triangle is just one. You have the famous slave triangle as well, which you all know about. Now, I want to just go to the, could we go to the next slide from this? Yes. So the mechanism through which Britain appropriated all of India's export surplus earnings was simple and very clever, but it's not written about. It was so clever that not even the Indian patriots who wrote about the drain of wealth fully figured out the mechanism, because it operated through a kind of financial mechanism, which once it is explained, it's quite simple. But when you don't know about it, it can be quite opaque and difficult to understand. So this mechanism worked as follows. There was a cabinet minister in Britain who was called the Secretary of State for India, Minister of Cabinet rank, who ran the India office in London. So the problem of Britain was how to continue the company's exploitation of India, how to continue the system whereby they appropriated all of the foreign exchange earnings that Indian exports earned. And the solution they worked out was the following, that the Secretary of State would issue a bill of exchange, because the full title of the Secretary of State was the Secretary of State for India in Council. It was called Council Bill. So the Secretary of State invited all foreigners, whether they were in the US or the continental countries or wherever they were, who imported goods from India. And look, you have to remit your payment, and the payment has to be paid in rupees to the Indian exporters from whom you're importing. Now, what you do is you simply deposit your payment in dollars, in sterling, in francs, marks, whatever it is. The currency is in gold, because we are now getting into the era of the gold standard from the last quarter of the 19th century, deposit it with me, and I will give you a bill of exchange to an equivalent rupee value. So when the foreign importer paid for this bill of exchange, would send it by post or by telegraph to the Indian exporter would go to the exchange bank. Exchange bank would then pay him the money in rupees. These bills were only cashable in rupees, not in any foreign exchange at all, even though foreign exchange had been earned. And none of the foreign exchange was credited even to the colonial government in India. All of it disappeared into the account in London of the British government. And the rupee equivalent was paid out of the sums which were earmarked in the budget. In the Indian budget in rupees, the total budget was divided into two parts. One part was expenditure in England or expenditure abroad. That is the second column you see. And the other part was expenditure within India of the total rupee budgetary revenues which were collected from the Indian people. So here you have the data from 1871 to 1900, these 30 years. You can see, and these data have been taken from the statistical abstracts for British India, and these data have not been presented anywhere before. So it's a very simple table. You can see that for each period, there is no equality between the council bills which are issued by the Secretary of State and expenditure in England. So the council bills are being issued against gold and foreign exchange, which is kept by the British government and spent. Actually, expenditure in England is a bit of misleading. It should rather be expenditure by England, because a lot of this gold and foreign exchange could be spent outside England for pursuing wars, military expenditures, not necessarily within England at all. But anyway, as long as you remember that, the title is okay. You can see that for individual periods, there is no match. Okay, they're different. But if you look at the total over the entire 30-year period, you will see that the total of the council bills issued is exactly equal to the total of the expenditure in England. That is, the whole of India's export surplus, commodity export surplus earnings, is being spent by England on its own account. Can I go to the next graph? I think, Julio, I think the next one is a graph. Yeah. So the same data are plotted here, the council bills value and expenditure in England for those 30 years. And you can see that the council bills, which are in blue, which is basically payment for India's export service, going up and down quite a lot. It's fluctuating a lot, and it's bound to fluctuate because it's fluctuating with the condition of global demand for Indian trade, for Indian products. And that is something over which Britain has no control. But the expenditure in England is rising much more steadily. So what they were doing is operating a kind of system of buffer stock in currency, in sterling at the London end and in rupees at the Indian end. Supposing in a particular year, the export surplus shoots up, council bills shoot up, as you can see is happening in the 1880s, early 1880s. Again, it is happening in the 1870s. You know, the blue line is going shooting up. Then this excess earnings of gold and foreign exchange by India is put in increasing the balances of the Secretary of State. It's a kind of buffer stock which goes up because they don't need to spend that much that particular year. And the converse is happening when the export surplus is coming down, as happens in the middle of the 1880s, as you can see it's plunging down. But the expenditure in England stays steady because then the Secretary of State's balances are drawn down to keep the expenditure steady. Similarly, at the Indian end. So there's some fascinating technicalities here, which I don't have time to go into, and it's not really necessary. But I just wanted to draw your attention to the fact that what the British government was doing here was operating a very complex system. It was a bimetallic system. The Indian rupee was silver, pound sterling was linked to gold, and whenever the gold to silver ratio fluctuated on the global market, they had a problem because they had to manage that in such a way that the transfer of tribute remained steady. It did not get affected by fluctuations in the value of gold relative to silver. And of course, during the period I'm talking about, there was an enormous decline in the value of silver relative to gold. So the rupee was depreciating, and that was happening because countries in Europe were selling their silver. They were making a transition to the gold standard, and they were demanding more gold. So silver coming onto the global market, gold in greater demand meant that the value of silver went down very, very sharply. And this affected the Indian taxpayers very badly, because the same amount of foreign exchange that Britain was taking every year, let us say by the 1880s, it would be taking 20 million pounds of India's foreign exchange earnings every single year. Sounds a very small amount now, but it was a very huge sum those days. Now that 20 million pound at the old exchange rate would have meant 200 million rupees in taxes had to be paid out against council bills. But now, if the rupee depreciated from 10 rupees per pound to 20 rupees per pound, the same 20 million pounds, instead of 200 million rupees, now would require 400 million rupees to be paid out from the Indian budget, and therefore the taxation had to be doubled on the Indian peasantry. Okay? And that is what they did. They actually doubled the taxation over this period that we're talking about. So it's not very surprising that in colonized India, you had massive famines, because this kind of increasing taxation to keep the transfer, the tribute flowing, when the population was already overtaxed, meant that the farmers, the peasants, had very little left for their own consumption. And whenever there was a harvest fluctuation, they just simply died. And there were massive famines, particularly in the decade of the 1860s, also in the 1880s, again in the 1890s. So this really brings me to the main problem with colonial exploitation, with the operation of imperialism. I will come back to how Britain used the foreign exchange that it drained from India, not only from India, from other colonies as well, from Malaya, from the Caribbean colonies, in the form of slave rent. So, but the Indian example is the one I'm most familiar with, and I have worked with the data, so that's what I'm presenting to you. The amount of the drain was really phenomenally large. Let me just quickly deal with the magnitude of the drain first, and then I'll come back to the, yes, can we go to the fifth slide? Okay, you're on the fourth. Let me talk about the fourth one then, since you're on that. No, go back. Yeah, that's it. Well, that was the fourth one. So the consequence was that what the tribute transfer mechanism meant was that surplus budgets were being operated in the colonies. And I don't think it was being operated only in India. Nobody has looked at what the British were doing with the revenue they collected in Malaya. And the amazing thing is that nobody has looked at the other colonized countries. They have not looked at what the Netherlands was doing in Java. I'm sure it was doing exactly the same thing as the British were doing in India. What the French were doing in Indochina with all the revenue they collected. And much later on, what Japan was doing in Korea for the short period that it ruled Korea. The same mechanism would have been in operation, but there is a huge amount of work that needs to be done, because nobody has studied this mechanism in the other colonized countries at all. They have simply thought of capitalist exploitation in the usual form of appropriating super profits owing to low wages in the colonies, but they've simply never looked at how the budgetary revenues were being utilized. So what this meant was that you had the operation of massive surplus budgets. Much more was being collected in taxes than was getting back, actually, into the economy concerned. And this means, in a simple Keynesian framework, the reverse operation of the Keynesian multiplier. That is, you had enormous increase in unemployment and huge fall in incomes, because you were taking much more away in taxes than you were actually putting back. It was not the normal operation of a sovereign economy. And actually, when you have this kind of surplus budgets, you have income contraction, demand contraction, and that is reflected in the falling availability, falling absorption of the basic food staples. I've been talking about extreme cases of famine, but other than the extreme cases in particular years and particular localities, as a general trend for the country as a whole, there was a descent into undernutrition. And the fall is very steep. The period here, we have the data from an American study of India, George Blynn's study, Agricultural Trends in India from 1897 to 1946, when you have pretty firm data, because that's when the census of India started in 1881, and right up to independence, you have pretty firm data on population. It also collected economic data. And of course, because the colonial government was very interested in taxation, it wanted to have an idea of what agricultural output was, so we have pretty firm data on that. So this is from George Blynn's study, which shows that the output and availability per head of food grains fell from 200 kilograms in the year 1900, or the 3 or 5 year period centered on 1900, to only 137 kilograms by 1947. Now, even 200 kilograms is pretty low. That is at the beginning of the period. It is lower than the average for the least developed countries today, which is 212 kilograms. It was lower already much lower than the average for Africa. And 137 kilograms, which we ended up with in 1946, of course, not even the poorest, least developed country has this low food grains consumption. And over this entire period, we can easily calculate the decline in kilocalories per head of population. It was around 600 kilocalories decline for an already low level. So really the population was driven down into undernutrition, into semi-starvation. And of course, British rule ended again with a massive famine in Bengal. It had started with a massive famine, the 1769-70 famine I started my talk with. It ended with another massive famine, 1943-44, when the burden of financing the Allies' military spending in South Asia was put on the Indian budget. And of course, Keynes was responsible for that. It was Keynes's bright idea to do that, to undertake what he called a profit inflation, in which prices are deliberately allowed to rise faster than incomes, so that there is a decline in consumption and forced savings are extracted from the population. The Bengal famine I have discussed in a paper published for Indian readers, because they don't know about the real reason for the Bengal famine, in which 3 million people died. And these 3 million people were non-combatants. Over a period of just 18 months, they belonged to the classes of the laboring poor, the completely landless wage-paid laborers, the poor peasants who were mainly dependent on wages, service providers like barbers and so on, carpenters and so on, fisher folk, all those who had to buy food from the market. These are the people who were affected. And the estimate of 3 million dead from the Bengal famine, and it was a deliberately engineered result of profit inflation. This estimate is from Professor Amartya Sen's book on poverty and famines, where he has a chapter on the Bengal famine. He says that a minimal estimate, it is 2.7 to 3.1 million people who died. But actually, Rajni Palmdutt puts the mortality higher at 3.5 million, quoting Indian sources, taking into account enhanced later morbidity, which led to further deaths a little later on. And if you look at the age structure of the population of Bengal at that time, it was a young population. 37% of the population consisted of children of age 14 years and less. So even if we assume that parents fed their children first and survived on the residues, so the proportion of the dead of the children was less, among the dead of children was less, let us say not 37%, let's say 1/3 or 30%. Even then, something like, 1 million children of 14 years of age and less would have died in that period in Bengal, 1943-44. And these are just numbers to you, but I can see those children because that is my home state. And I've been to villages in Bengal. So in the middle of 1943, they've had their baths, their hair slicked down with oil, they're running off to school with a slate under their arms, and within 18 months, they're dead. I have called this in my paper a genocide by economic means. And this again is something that nobody actually has talked about. Professor Sen indicated in just one sentence the reason for the famine, but he did not expand on this. So the reason I said that I would talk not only about the past, but also about the present impact of imperialism is precisely this, that for me, the most important outcome of colonialism and imperialism was this impact, which led to undernutrition at best and famines at worst. Now, Bengal is a region, if you look at the map, you'll see that it contains the delta of mighty rivers, the Ganges coming from the west through the Indo-Gangetic plain, the Brahmaputra breaking up into its tributaries, Padma, Meghna, and there's a huge delta there. It consists of double crop land. And in many areas, you have 3 crops. It had never known famine. Normally, famines don't occur there. No famine has taken place there in the last 50 years. So these colonial famines took place because the basic driving force behind acquisition of political power over these colonies of conquest was to get access to their enormous biodiversity, to export the commodities which the countries located in the cold temperate north cannot produce then, could not produce then, and cannot produce today. And this is the element of continuity between the past and today. Okay? The entire consumption structure of North European and North American populations has been transformed over the centuries of colonialism and imperialism because they had access to tropical biodiversity, access by force in the past, and access through methods which are replicating the economic results of colonialism today. Though force is no longer in use, although they do no longer have control over taxation revenues, but there are other ways in which the same result is being ensured, which I will come to in a moment. Now, let me just see. Can we go on to the next slide? I'll just give you an idea of the magnitude of the foreign exchange earnings which were drained from India. And I don't really have much time. But basically, these earnings were so huge that they could not possibly be absorbed by Britain, which was a small country, everything's said and done. But what Britain did was to use these earnings to export capital to countries of European settlement. That is what had started as colonies of settlement, as opposed to colonies of conquest. To North America, to Argentina, South Africa, Australia, and of course, an area with which it had trade relations and investment relations always, which was not colonized, which is the European continent. Now, if we look at how have I calculated the drain, again, this has not been done before. It's very simple. Given the fact that the council bills value in sterling measure the drain because it consisted of the foreign exchange earnings of Indians which were never paid for to Indians at all, which were simply appropriated. So these earnings we can easily calculate from British trade data and Indian trade data. So from the first column gives you the absolute numbers in million pounds from 1765 to 1836. This is from the British trade data. Mitchell and Dean, Abstract of British Historical Statistics. Then from 1837 to 1900, we have it from the Indian sources, statistical abstracts. So the value in red, 867 million pounds, is the entire absolute amount from 1765 to 1900, which was taken by Britain. Now, if I capitalize it at 5% per annum, then I get a figure. If I capitalize up to 1900 in the second column, which is now in billions of pounds, not in millions. So it's 38.4 billion pounds over this period. And if pound sterling doesn't mean much to you, then in terms of dollars, It is $186 billion, okay, in US currency. And of course, the exchange rate those days was around $5.84 to £1 sterling. You had to pay that much to buy £1. Indians had to buy only 3 rupees to buy $1. Today we have to pay 72 rupees to buy $1. So in dollar terms, it appears even more huge because of the exchange rate. $186 billion of India's foreign exchange earnings up to 1900. I didn't have space in this table, so I couldn't include the figures from 1900 until independence in 1947. Now, if you look at the right at the bottom, this tribute or drain from India expressed as a multiple, this is not percentage, it's a multiple, it works out as a multiple of the United Kingdom gross domestic product. Up to 1836, when the absolute GDP of the UK in 1836 was a little under 600 million pounds, the Indian drain already accounted for more than 2.5 times this GDP. Up to 1900, the Indian drain, capitalized value of course, accounts for 20 times British GDP in 1900, which was a little below 2 billion. And up to 1947, when India became independent, it accounts for 38 times the 10 billion GDP of the UK. It was enormous. And most Americans don't have a clue that quite a lot of these foreign exchange earnings went actually to develop North America through the huge exports of capital that Britain made. Because what Britain was doing at this time as the leader of the capitalist world it was of course running in the period I'm talking about, particularly from the mid-19th century onwards. It was running current account deficits with the European continent and with North America. But normally a country which runs a current account deficit cannot export capital to that country if there is bilateral balance, okay? Because the balance of payments has to balance. With bilateral balancing, you can only invest abroad if you are running a current account surplus vis-a-vis that region. But Britain was running a current account deficit. It was importing much more than it was exporting from Canada and the US and the European continent. And at the same time, it was investing. Therefore, the two deficits, and you know, exporting capital is a negative item on your balance of payment, on any country's balance of payments. So you have a deficit on the current account, you have a deficit on the capital account. The two deficits add up to an enormous balance of payments deficit that Britain had vis-a-vis US and continental Europe combined. According to S.P. Saul's estimates in studies in British overseas trade, by 1910, the deficit Britain had was 120 million pounds with the US, Canada, and European continent, which was a very large sum for those times, amounting to some 10% of UK GDP. Well, completely unfazed. It was covering its deficit by appropriating the foreign exchange earnings of its colonies. It had complete control over both the budgets as well as the external accounts of its colonies. So it showed India as owing it 60 million pounds in 1910. India owed nothing to Britain other than its managed trade deficit of around 19 million pounds. So 41 million pounds was simply taken as tribute. And of course, for external balancing, Britain would put a whole lot of arbitrary, invisible items that it said India owed to Britain, okay? So this was just really a very clever system. And, you know, you really have to look at what was happening to the British economy, what was happening to the American economy, what was happening to the colonies of conquest. So it's very complicated. And you have to look at the international matrix of global trade and investment. It's not very surprising that it's taken decades to build up some kind of picture of what was actually happening. But for capital exports from Britain, and Britain was the largest capital exporter in the world. France was also a capital exporter, but it was a long way behind Britain. these capital exports helped to build infrastructure in the United States and Canada. It laid down railways, helped to build the factories, laid down roads, which simply would not have been possible without capital exports of this magnitude. So, you know, everything was interconnected. And in fact, the world was far more interconnected, far more globalized in ways that people have still not understood, because they have not looked at the whole question of tribute transfer from the colonies at all. Nobody has looked at what these countries were doing with the revenues they collected from their colonies, not even the patriots and nationalists in the colonized countries themselves. You see, there's a lot of work to be done in the sphere of economic history. There's an entire, as it were, continent to be explored, which has remained so far more or less completely unexplored. Okay, so let me try and wind up by bringing the discussion more to the present. See, this continuity between the past and the present, which people do not see, for me, lies in the fact that the basic, as it were, reason that a handful of maritime European nations undertook this very peculiar business of going halfway across the world. And these journeys were very long. You know, when there was no Suez Canal, it was like 18,000 nautical miles you had to travel to get to India, and even more to get to China. And the journey was hazardous. The climate in these countries was dangerous. So what was that motive force? That motive force, unfortunately, still has not disappeared, because tropical biodiversity compared to monocropping in the cold temperate north is a fact of life. And this is a fact of life, a material reality, which no amount of technological progress under capitalism can alter. You still can't alter your climate, can't alter the fact that North America has only one crop per year, compared to, let us say, Vietnam, which produces over a period of 4 years, 11 crops from the same plot of land. It has a cropping intensity of almost three crops a year. And India has lower cropping intensity because a lot of India is not as fertile as the Mekong Delta, but even we have a cropping intensity which is greater than 2. Now that reality has not gone away. That is a reality which has been completely ignored in the conceptually impoverished discourse of economics emanating from northern universities, starting with David Ricardo. So if you look at Ricardo's model of comparative advantage, Ricardo makes a crucial assumption to reach his conclusion that specialization according to comparative cost and exchange amongst countries always benefits the participants in trade. And that crucial assumption he makes in his two goods, two country model is both countries can produce both goods. Actually, the implicit assumption he makes is that all countries can produce all goods, which is of course factually not true. Today's industrially advanced countries located in the cold temperate north could not in the past and cannot today produce tropical goods, tropical crops. They cannot even produce their own summer crops in their winter. So there's enormous seasonality of supply from within their own countries. And yet the consumption basket of your rich populations has become so highly diversified. Go to the supermarket, there is no seasonality. Provided you pay a little higher price in the middle of winter, you can buy roses, you can buy any tropical crop you like. Nobody even thinks, where is all this coming from? At what cost to the people who are supplying it? And there is a very high cost, because no matter how productive tropical lands are, they cannot actually continue to supply the demands of rich northern populations and supply the basic food demands of their own populations, particularly in the neoliberal era. In theory, they could do it, and this is something I have repeatedly said in my past lectures also. Yes, in theory, if you invested enough in our lands, you could raise productivity enough then you don't have to actually divert land and resources to export crops at the expense of your own basic staple production and consumption going down. The whole point about the colonial system and the system which developed over the last 25 years in India and over the last 35 years in Africa and Latin America, under neoliberalism, is that governments are told, you have to cut back. Leave it to the market. You can't use your budgetary funds for intervening in the market. And you can't do it in order to raise your productivity either. So government after government have been pliant. In any case, their economists are all trained in northern universities. They're all told that Ricardo's theory tells you that you will benefit from specialization. Why do you want to produce food grains at all? Why do you want to have a public procurement and distribution system for food grains for your population? Buy from the global market. That is the new definition of food security. And let your lands get specialized in producing the crops in which you have a comparative advantage. And of course, those are the crops that you need to fill the supermarket shelves in the north. And nobody, of course, in our own universities, Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage is taught uncritically, whereas it contains a basic fallacy. You see, in order to define relative advantage at all, relative cost at all, for two countries producing two goods, let us say the country one producing good A and B, country two producing also good A and B, you have to be able to define by reducing the output of good A by 1 unit, you will release labor, which if you divert to increasing the output of good B, how much of output can you get of good B by doing this, by reducing output A by 1 unit and diverting those resources to output B. Now that particular variable is not definable at all. For the United States, for Canada, for Germany, for UK. If you're talking about, even Ricardo's own example, that is wine and what was the other thing? Cloth, woolen cloth is what he was talking about. Paul Samuelson, of course, is a very intelligent man. He realized there was a problem with Ricardo's example. So he changed that example. He has a paper called, what's the paper called? I forget the exact title. It is in his collected papers. It'll come back to me. Anyway, so he changes he's discussing Ricardo on his model, but he changes Ricardo's example from wine and cloth to food and cloth. And he doesn't tell you why he's doing it. Because grape wine was not producible in England at the time Ricardo was writing. England is, the temperature is too variable. It doesn't have a mean July isotherm. But changing the example does not change the basic fallacy of the model. That is, the assumption he is making does not hold for a general theory of trade. No. All countries cannot produce all goods. And that is a reality which is still here today. That is why I said that these theories are intellectually impoverished because they contain basic fallacies. And I'm sure Karl Marx would have spotted that fallacy in a moment. Because unlike Ricardo, Adam Smith and Marx were both trained philosophers. And if you study philosophy, you study logic. And this is a logical problem in Ricardo. This fallacy is a particular type of material fallacy. And Marx would have spotted it in no time. The only problem is Marx never got around to discussing trade at all in Capital. Capital remained a closed model, in the formal model of capital is a closed capitalist system. If he had got around to doing what he said he would do in his, introduction to a critique of political economy, he sets out what his program is, what he intends to do. And he completed only half of his work. The remaining part of his work, where he was going to study the whole process of international exchange, the state, the world market, that part remained unexplored. So if he had done so, he would have spotted this fallacy, I'm sure, in Ricardo immediately. Now, the problem then is that the method through which now advanced countries, finance capital in advanced countries, operates in the new imperialist era. And imperialism is alive and well and operating in the global south, but under a new system, under which they tell the office bearers, those who run governments, they make it a point to get people over to northern universities and train them in all these fallacious theories. Then they're put back in very important positions in commerce ministries and finance ministries. And they are told that, what you're doing is all wrong. You should cut back on state spending and you should open up to global trade. So the two basic pillars of neoliberalism, as I'm sure you all know by now already, two basic pillars have been. Yes, you could go to the next slide, please. You go to the next one. Yes, Bengal famine I've talked about, so carry on. Next one, and then the next one, and the next one, and the next one. Yes, this is just the same thing, the fall that in availability that had. Could you go to the next one, please? Yes. So again, this is a graph I've shown very often when I'm talking about this, is that during the period of Nehruvian dirigism in India, this was from 1950 to the late 1980s. So roughly, or you can even say up to early 1990s. There was a cordoning of the Indian economy from global trade. And therefore, there was a lot of emphasis given to reversing the trend of decline we had earlier. And we did succeed, raising the food grain availability per capita. And this is from official data from the economic survey, which is brought out annually by the government from the finance ministry. We did succeed in raising it up to the early 90s. Now, the neoliberal era in India starts from the early 90s. Could we go to the next slide? When India starts opening up to global trade, in fact, it's pressurized under the WTO and by individual governments, by the US, Canada, and the European governments in particular. Dismantle your protective measures. This is what happens. And open up your trade so that we can access your land, basically. So the cropping pattern again shifts, just as it did in the colonial period, away from food grains towards the exportable crops. And this is what you get in the availability per capita in food grains for our own population. Now, China has not been, this is what I call the inverse relation between exports and domestic food security. China has not been exempt either from the operation of this relation. I think I've already taken like 55 minutes. So if anybody is interested in what I have to say about China and the fact of declining food grain availability in China during the period of its export thrust, I can perhaps take it up when you're talking about questions. But this is the thing. Let me wind up here now. And I had to say some things also about the attack which is going on right now through the WTO on the food sovereignty of developing countries in order to release our land for the products that the North wants, basically, which it has always wanted in the past, which it wants today. But let me take that up, perhaps in the responses to questions. Okay.
Thank you very much, Professor Patnaik. We have very limited time for questions, answers, and discussion. So yeah, people are applauding. Okay, so let's...
could you kindly, Julio, could you kindly take 2 or 3 questions and then I can try to answer them? That'll be better.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So if you can keep your questions and your comments.
Julio, take off the shared screen. So.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah,
I'll mute myself.
I'm not sharing the screen. It's on share now. Okay, people, go ahead. Let me see if there are questions here. There is a question by DB. It says, T. Roy of the London School of Economics says that home charges were for administration/governance, and then after this was paid out, officials remitted these goods. So in reality, it was administration payments. Would you say this is an accurate characterization? That's a question. And then Rinat.
Repeat the question, please.
Sure. It says that T. Roy of the London School of Economics says that home charges were for administration/governance. And then after this was paid out, officials remitted these goods. So would you say that this is an accurate characterization?
Okay.
Right? And this is another question. Didn't the system depend on collaboration of local ruling groups? At the very beginning, you mentioned local mercenaries. And there is another question by Anthony O'Brien, following Renat. Yes, the ruling system rules as a system. The ruling system rules as a system that is a schema in which everyone is defined into the role and no one has no role. The roles include resistance.
That is a comment, I think, not a question.
Yeah, it is a comment. Indeed.
Yeah.
And then Russell, do you have a question?
Yeah, I was hoping that vis-a-vis your comments about Marx's not finishing his project and looking at capital as a closed system, could you remark on Rosa Luxemburg's contribution in trying to open that up? Yeah, and I'd love to hear your views about that and how cogent you take Rosa Luxemburg's arguments to be.
So let me take those questions and then we can go on to some more if necessary. The first one from LSE about home charges were for administration. Well, you know, Marshall, I think, started this misconception that home charges were for administrative costs. But if I analyze the home charges, then the costs of administering India were paid for the personnel, both civilian administrators and military personnel who were actually in India were paid their salaries in rupees out of the Indian budget. Okay, it was only when they went home on leave or when soldiers went on leave, furlough leave, and the pension allowances, which were payable in sterling and which are administrative charges. Now, if I analyze the home charges, then these accounted for 12.5% on average over from 1860s right up to independence of the total total tribute. And even if you know, Dadabhai Nauroji's demand had been met, supposing there had been complete Indianization and no Britons were anywhere there in administration or in the army, I don't think it would have made a difference. Because, you know, what they put down as invisible demands was completely under their control. So they could have easily, in fact, I mentioned this in a paper I wrote as well, they could have easily put down, for example, the cost of maintaining Balmoral Castle, or not just Balmoral, several of the Queen's castles in England, because she was Empress of India. They could put down anything they liked. So even though local administration, as Dadabhai Nauroji had asked for, would have been a good thing on its independently, it really, in my opinion, would have made no difference at all to the tribute or transfer. Now, the second question about collaboration with local groups. Oh, absolutely. As far as India is concerned, and I think this is true of every colonized country, the British did not rule India on their own. they were very good to, and they could not because there were very few. And there were classes within India who benefited from British rule. I give the example of my own family. My grandfather was a faithful servant of the British Raj. He was forced to join British service because his father died when he was like 16 years old. So he had a widowed mother and an aunt and siblings to look after. And when he retired, he was given an honorary title, which was Rai Bahadur. I have that document signed by Viceroy Linlithgow in 1946. Must have been the last Viceroy before Mountbatten. And the professional classes in India, those who became doctors and lawyers and so on, they were supporters of British. The people who really lost out were the 80 to 85% of the population who belonged to the classes of the laboring poor that I was talking about. And after all, the professional classes of the landed gentry did not die in any famine. Some of them did very well out of famines, especially the merchants and the traders. It was really the 80% of the population comprising the laboring poor on whose backs the whole system operated. And I regret to say that the caste system in India, I think, helped the British rulers a lot. Because in any case, the Indian elite looked down on the laboring poor and have done so for centuries. And a lot of them continue to do so to this day. Most unfortunately, we have this ugly legacy of casteism, just as in the US, you have the ugly legacy of racism, which is again rearing its head. Yes, there's always been collaboration. But really the question is whether there are some members of the well-to-do classes who can detach themselves from their own class interest sufficiently to look at the matter in an objective manner. Karl Marx himself certainly did not come from a deprived class. He was born into a well-to-do professional family. All right, so there was a comment. The third one was a comment. The Marxist unfinished project. Well, was it continued by Rosa Luxemburg? Of course, it was continued first by Rosa Luxemburg in her accumulation of capital, and then of course by Lenin. But I would say that valuable, enormously valuable though Luxemburg's contribution is, it still had to depend on whatever material was available at that time, as did Lenin's. And whatever material they had about colonialism and its operation really came from the colonizers themselves. And the colonizers themselves became very tight-lipped. In India, after the Great Rebellion of 1857 to 59, they were not at all frank about how they operated the mechanism for obvious reasons. Because from their point of view, the moment they admitted to the truth, there would be this pestiferous, from their point of view, Indian patriots who would get after them, like Dadabhai Nauroji and others, and say that, raise questions in British Parliament about the oppression of British rule. So they kept very quiet about the system that they operated. Coming back to Rosa Luxemburg, you see, if you read her carefully, you will see that she is basically looking upon the colonies as providing the external market that she says Marxist system lacked. So she's looking upon the colonies basically from the point of view of there being markets. The whole thrust of my presentation has been that there were markets, of course, later on, but the major thrust of the Western powers to obtain colonies of conquest was not to have them as markets because they had nothing to sell at that time, but as sources of raw materials and of food. What people don't realize, if you look at the actual data, for the 17th century and for the 18th century, and trade data is one area where the British kept very good records because trade was so good for them. They didn't have national income accounting statistics, but they had trade data. You see that the major category of imports into Britain from the colonies was not raw materials. It was foodstuffs all through, even during the rise of the factory system. foodstuffs remained more important than raw materials. And to this day, it is foodstuffs which remain the most important element of northern imports from southern countries. Well, the same goes for Lenin. He relied primarily on Hobson. Very good, but again, none of them really, none of the British economists, those who criticized British rule in India, Digby or Hobson and so on, really had a clue about the actual mechanism of transfer. You don't find any mention of the fact that India's foreign exchange earnings and that of the other colonies were being appropriated. They were in fact never allowed to reach the country concerned. They were preempted in London itself through the mechanism of the Council Bill. I would dearly love some Malaysian economists to find out what the British were doing in Malaya. They didn't have a Secretary of State for Malaya, as far as I'm aware. They never had a Secretary of State for the Dominions. There was no Secretary of State in London for Canada or for Australia, saying that to foreign importers of Canadian goods, give me your foreign exchange, I will give you a council bill, which you go and encash in Canadian currency in Canada. So dominions were very different from the colonies of conquest. So this is the element I'm really focusing on, because the use of the colonies as markets is something which has been discussed. Maybe not in full, there's still research required, but their use as source of food and raw materials has not been discussed. And that is a use which continues to this day, which has an adverse impact on the food security of the populations of these countries.
As this the discussion is very exciting, and I think a lot of you probably have thoughts and probably want to share them. You have my email address, so you can email me your questions, comments, and all that, and I will relay them to Professor Patnaik because the limited time that we have. But we have now Ying Chen and Barbara Foley and Raju in that order.
Thank you. Thank you. So yeah, thank you, Professor, for thought-provoking talk. So I've been following closely the debate between you and a few scholars who basically, let's say, are critical of the idea that imperialism is still relevant. So I would like to hear your thoughts on those arguments particularly. So for example, there are arguments based on the direct observation that today working class in the global south, global north seem to have lost their privileges, and they can no longer be considered as labor aristocracy anymore because we see maybe Chinese or Indian capitalists exploiting workers in Europe or in the US. So how would you say the imperialism's mechanism is manifesting it today, in today's world, for example? And another thing is from the economic argument that people would be arguing that maybe the price of the agricultural products are declining because of technological advancement instead of a deliberate imposition of the income deflation on the global south. So how would you also respond to those critique? Thank you. You muted yourself.
Is there any other question I can take? Anybody else? No?
Yeah, yes, Barbara Foley, yeah. Raju. Barbara, you need to.
Okay, I've got it. Okay, I'll be quick. These are it's a wonderful talk and the questions are great. I wrote this out to the chat and I'll just elaborate a teeny bit. What I wrote is, what is the relationship between imperialism as a system involving the super exploitation of factory labor and imperialism as a system involving global agricultural expropriation, as you have been focusing on? And I'm thinking here of recent books by John Smith and Emmanuel Ness, et cetera, who are talking about what's going on in the factories in the South. And then sort of popular books like Dying for an iPhone that I read recently and really knocked my socks off. So I just wonder what the connection is between these different modes of exploitation.
Okay, let me take Barbara's question first. and this also relates to Ying, you really want me to connect with people who have a different view of imperialism, which I haven't done yet. And that is because I've been developing my own view, which I don't think has been, and Prabhat and I have been developing our own views, which I don't think have been put forward before, right? So I agree that we have to engage with other scholars who have put forward other views. But maybe I take the two questions together and try and answer them together. Basically, I think a lot of these arguments about China exploiting people abroad, and India also has been, Indians also have been buying some land in Ethiopia and so on. By the way, Indian efforts have been a resounding failure. The particular corporations which have tried to buy land and operated in Ethiopia has failed as far as I know. But anyway, there have been arguments that this represents a kind of imperialism, which all that is hogwash and complete nonsense. And it is being put forward by people who have never studied the mechanism of what imperialism, colonialism, and imperialism actually meant, which is what I've been saying all through my talk, that they have absolutely no idea that the world was more globalized than they think they were 200 years ago or 100 years ago. And they themselves would not be, the advanced countries would not be where they are today without the exploitation of the global south in the forms that I had mentioned, because this particular business of appropriating all foreign exchange earnings is something nobody has understood or talked about. And what was so special about the global south? You know, we didn't think we were special. Even to this day, our economists are convinced, because they're told again and again, you come from a poor country where people are very poor, they think we are very poor. They have never realized that we are resource rich. And that was the major objective. And that was the major reason why you had this very peculiar phenomenon, which we see only from 1600 onwards. It's pretty recent. In the scale of global history, that's pretty recent. You know, it's only like 400 odd years old, this phenomenon. Why people had to come halfway across the world to colonize it? What is it that we had that they wanted, that they didn't have? And this is a question, in fact, which is inverted completely in the Northern discourse. Nobody criticizes Ricardo's theory of trade, even though it's an absurd theory based on a material fallacy. Nobody says that the North is dependent on the South. On the contrary, Lester Brown says, how will we feed China? As though it is China is the backward country which needs to be fed, ignoring the fact that, you know, that India and China and other countries in the global South have not only been feeding in the industrializing North, they've been providing the raw materials which the North could not itself grow. All right. So the whole, as it were, discourse deals with completely inverted categories. And I would say that even progressive scholars in the North are affected by this discourse. It takes a lot of effort to actually get your head around the fact that things were the opposite of what you've been told they were, all through your college years and later on. That the matter was exactly the opposite. It was not the serf who was dependent on the feudal lord. The serf had his own independent, you know, plot which he could tell. It was the feudal lord who was dependent on the serf and who exploited the serf by enserfing him, all right? So one has to get around this problem that the whole of this intellectually impoverished theorization of capitalism under development has to be rethought and made richer by getting rid of the fallacies. Now, the modes of operation of capital that Marx explored in his 3 volumes of Capital, as you know, the first volume was published in his lifetime. The next 2 volumes were published only after he passed away by Engels. Those certainly gave us a deep insight into the normal mode of operation of capital through the exploitation of wage labor. But the part of the exploitation which he did not explore, and I'm sure he would have got to it had he lived not until just his 60s, but had he lived for 100 years and had been mentally active for this for all that time, is the other type of exploitation, where superimposed on the exploitation of the landlord, of the tenant through rent, superimposed on exploitation of the capitalist of wage labor, you have the exploitation of entire peoples by taking away their product without paying them for it. It's as simple as that. You simply take it away because you have the political power to do so. You have the taxation right in the case of India. In the case of the Caribbean colonies, you take slave rent because you have enslaved human beings. All you give them is their bare means of subsistence. Whatever surplus they produce in the form of commodities is simply taken away. And they're costless for the home country. They don't have to be paid for. It causes no external liability. So it has to do with the macroeconomic relationships of trade and investment between today's global south, the colonies of conquest, which are now independent, and today's global north, that, as I've repeatedly said, has not been explored even in the Marxist literature. And the reason is, unfortunately, that Marxists have been very lazy about it. A lot of Marxists think of Marx as a kind of, the way an Indian would think of the Vedas and the Upanishads, a sort of received wisdom, which Marx himself would not have liked. I mean, how much do you expect a single individual to do in one lifetime? And a lifetime which is curtailed by ill health, by financial problems, by the death of most of your 7 children before you yourself died. It was an amazingly difficult life. How much do you expect one person to do, or Marx and Engels together to do? Why are Marxists so lazy? Why don't they look at the actual relationships which develop after Marx's death? They don't. They simply look at Marx's 3 volumes as a kind of Bible, and then they have a textual analysis of whatever he said. They don't even look at the reality of the other type of exploitation that I've been talking about. And of course, the matter has become very dire over the last 25 or 30 years, precisely because you had a sort of resurgence of finance capital globally. As you all know, I don't have to belabor that point. You live in the United States, you've seen the results of that, before your own eyes. This whole business of, the state leaving everything to the market, of not intervening. But by the way, the US is still a far more interventionist state, even though it's the home of industrial capitalism, or the leader of industrial capitalism today, than most third world states are. Most third world states, including my state, collects much less in taxes. They don't have a wealth tax. They don't tax the rich. They raise much less in taxes than the US does. And they spend much less on development than the US does. They don't look after their agricultural population. The United States subsidizes its farmers to a phenomenal degree. Something like half of the total value of US farm output is given as subsidy every year to American farmers so that they can compete globally. Our governments don't do that. Of course, they don't do it because they're intellectually hegemonized, and to a great extent, they let themselves be hegemonized because they have been incorporated into the global elite. They themselves are well off. They can travel anywhere in the world anytime they want. There are huge, vast reserve armies of labor in their own countries. Services are cheap, goods are cheap, and so on. Okay, I'm getting a little away from the point here of the question about declining agricultural terms of trade and so on. Now, that is so complicated, I will need another hour to answer your question there, because it really has to do, terms of trade and power have to do with international power relations. I mean, if you ask yourself the question, why is it that I could buy $1, for 3 rupees even in the 1930s, and I have to pay 70 rupees today to buy $1, all right? Even though my rupee purchases 3 times as much goods as the equivalent number of cents does in the US. Then that has to do with the whole business of the operation of international power relations, which ultimately the relations of economic domination and subordination playing themselves out in different ways. In a different way from direct political control, it is now operating much more through ideology, through ideological hegemonization, and it's operating in a very clever way because all countries which are class divided countries have their elites, and the elites can be bought off. They can be suborned, they can be corrupted, they can be quite easily manipulated to believe that they should follow such and such policy, which is actually harming the majority of their own population and benefiting the elites in advanced countries. So I think this whole question of looking at the ideology of imperialism is very important. And I would again repeat that many of those who call themselves Marxists or think of themselves as progressive are not immune to the operation of this kind of hegemonization. They take for granted theories and ideas which actually, from a point of view of logic and fact, are really complete balderdash. They're all complete nonsense. But you need a certain degree of, as it were, I think, brashness to be able to say that. And that is something I haven't acquired overnight. I used to believe in Ricardo's theory and think he was a great man. By the way, Ricardo's theory of rent also contains a fallacy. Ricardo's theory of rent is not the same as Adam Smith's theory or Karl Marx's theory of rent. So I've written about that in the introduction to some volumes I edited called The Agrarian Question in Marx and His Successors, came out from Leftward. The first volume has a very long critique of Ricardo based on Marx's own critique, because in Theories of Surplus Value, Marx is scathing about the logical mistakes that Ricardo makes on the theory of rent. That's why I said, if he had got round to opening up his closed economy, he would have been equally scathing about Ricardo's theory of trade. But the reason Ricardo has been elevated to this godlike position is because he was the most effective and convincing spokesperson, the ideologue of the rising industrial capitalism of Britain. And he was so clever at a formal level that people ignore the fact that he made absolutely very simple logical mistakes when you look at applied logic. Because, he himself was very, very modest. He said, he was a stockbroker. He was not highly educated. He said, I have not read philosophy or history like Adam Smith has done, or as Karl Marx, Karl Marx came later, as Adam Smith has done. So he couldn't be referring to Karl Marx at all, but he said, compared to Adam Smith, I haven't read much. And that is true. He did not know his own country's history. He did not know the real circumstances under which Portugal was obliged to produce wine for British consumption and take British cloth, which was the naval pressure which was exercised by Britain to sign the Treaty of Methuen, the Methuen Treaty in 1707. He didn't know about that. He didn't know philosophy. He had not studied logic. So he could make very simple logical mistakes, like in the theory of comparative advantage. And more unfortunate than Ricardo's logical mistakes is the fact that very clever economists like Paul Samuelson knew very well it was a logical mistake, but chose to hide it by simply changing the example without telling you why he changed that example. And that is what you find in textbooks today. And our own economists teach a fallacious theory to our students to this day, 200 years after Ricardo. Okay, I think I've completely run out of time. I'm sorry I haven't been able to answer all your questions, but I would be very happy if you write down some questions and send it to Julio, then I'll try and get back.
Yes, time is a tyrant. I will collect the questions that were typed in the chat and relay them to you. And also you can email them. Sorry, Rajadas, couldn't answer you, couldn't pose your question. I will communicate with you my logical defense of Ricardo's comparative advantage argument and other ideas that I have in my head. Thank you so very much, Professor Patnaik, for your excellent presentation, very thought-provoking. Everybody who has in the last 40, 50 years studied data on colonial relations, have come up with this idea that the expropriation of the global South by Northwestern countries has been much larger, and quantity leads to quality leaps. So definitely it's a very persuasive argument. The discussion will continue offline. Thank you very much, Professor Patnaik. I'm gonna please unmute all of you so that you can applaud Professor Patnaik for her excellent presentation.
Thank you so much, Professor Patnaik.
I can't see you. I don't know whether you can hear me. Thank you also for your patience in listening. Thank you.